This is the most powerful building in the French Republic, the Élysée Palace in Paris.
When you step inside, you know that you are entering the very heart of power.
The bastion of the French head of state, this showcase for French craftsmanship has welcomed and dazzled some of the most famous people in the world over the centuries. Few have had the privilege to enter here.
You can imagine de Gaulle, Pompidou, Mitterrand, or Chirac in this office. In a way, it's as if the whole history of the Fifth Republic has been brought together in this one office.
Yet on the face of it, this classical building looks nothing like the high-tech fortress it really is.
It was never destined to be that. So today, it's almost admirable that the head of state lives here, and lives here well.
After a huge transformation process that ran from the 18th to the 21st centuries, this place became the nation's seat of command. Structural modifications were undertaken that could have had dire consequences.
When they dismantled the paneling, the walls beneath were in a terrible state. Removing one part could have caused the whole thing to collapse.
And yet the palace stood firm and expanded. Since the time of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the eastern courtyard has even been home to the president's bunker, Jupiter HQ, and the controls for the nuclear deterrent.
There are many things that are classified as state secrets, but this is the state secret of state secrets.
How did one of the biggest private homes of the 18th century become this 21st century hyperstructure? How was it modernized and adapted to the requirements of power and the security of the head of state? This is a story of the most important palace in France. In Paris, just a few steps from the Champs-Élysées, one of the most famous avenues in the world, is an illustrious address, 55 Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Here, behind the ceremonial gate and surrounded by high walls, is the power base of the President of the French Republic. With a 1.5-hectare garden, this imposing structure, which is 125 meters long, 110 meters wide, and almost completely invisible from the street, has 365 rooms across 11,000 square meters and 4 floors. It is a maze of offices and reception rooms that is also home to the private apartments of the head of state. A strategic location under high protection.
Where there is power, there is security. And the security here is mainly provided by the Republican Guard. There are 400 officers ensuring round-the-clock security for the Élysée, along with the police, who provide protection for the Republic's top officials.
And at the center of it all is the President of the Republic, the man who must be protected at all costs. The Elysée is a fortress where you can only enter or leave with the authorization of its security teams.
The presidents are prisoners of the palace in that they cannot simply come and go as they please.
Gendarmes, police, everyone there is standing in the way of your freedom. That's the price of power.
And at the center is an underground bunker that is classified as a state secret, hidden beneath the eastern courtyard of the palace. Jupiter HQ was created under President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. In 1974, right after he was elected, he realized that the Élysée was a seat of power that was not up to the same standards as the White House or the Kremlin.
One of the first things, according to our knowledge of the introductory protocol, was a military briefing with the Army Chief of Staff, who explained to the President how the nuclear deterrent operated. Because the President of the Republic is the only one who can press the nuclear button. And during this briefing, Giscard realized that the control system for the nuclear threat was hidden behind the moldings in one of the big reception rooms on the ground floor of the Élysée. He was kind of surprised.
France was a nuclear power. It was unacceptable to rely on a button hidden in the paneling. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing immediately ordered the construction of a command post at the Élysée that was fit for purpose. A forgotten part of the basement that was being used as a storeroom might do the trick. It had been constructed 40 years previously, when the Nazis were threatening the whole of Europe. Commissioned in 1936 by President Albert Lebrun, this 250 square meter bunker was designed to shelter 100 people. Buried 8 meters underground, its concrete walls were 1.6 meters thick and could resist a 500-kilogram bomb. It contained an office for the president, a comms center, an infirmary, an electric generator, and an air filtration system. Furthermore, it had 3 exits, including an emergency one. It was the perfect place for the new Jupiter HQ control center.
Jupiter HQ is protected from electromagnetic waves, so no communication can be intercepted by reconnaissance or spy satellites.
This secret strategic place had only been recorded by one camera in more than 40 years, when President Giscard d'Estaing took part in a full-scale drill.
It has now become a kind of command center. Today, the defense meetings held every Wednesday before the cabinet meets take place at Jupiter HQ. So it really is where key decisions are taken and from where military operations are monitored.
An underground bunker, around-the-clock police presence. If there is one forbidden and secret place in France, it is the Élysée Palace. Few are permitted to enter. And fewer still are those who know why this 18th century private home and its annexes, namely the Palais d'Alma and the Hôtel Marigny, where some 800 people work every day, were chosen to be the nerve center and the symbol of the French Republic. Paris, 1715. Leaving the splendor of Versailles behind on the death of the Sun King, Philippe d'Orléans, regent of the kingdom on behalf of the young King Louis XV, who was just 5 years old, set up home in the Palace des Tuileries. Once again the center of power, Paris attracted a swarm of courtiers eager for special favors. Among them was Louis-Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, the Count of Évreux.
The Count of Évreux was not a very amiable person. He was a military man. He came from a very noble old family, but they didn't have a great fortune. Quite the opposite.
In order to build his fortune, the Count married a young commoner aged just 12. The daughter of Antoine Crozat, a financier with the biggest fortune in Paris.
He was looking for a dowry, and the young Marianne Crozat earned herself the nickname of My Little Gold Ingot.
The Count of Évreux was thirsty for power and recognition, and began building the most fabulous private mansion Paris had ever seen.
Having a mansion was a social necessity, as one couldn't hold on to one's rank in the eyes of king and court if one didn't have a mansion. And architecture was one of the means to boost one's standing if one wanted to be an aristocrat.
All he had to do was find a site in the capital that would suit this ambitious project. The greedy and tight-fisted Count of Évreux set his sights on some land in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré to the west of the city. It was cheaper than the sought-after neighborhood of Saint-Germain.
Before the construction began, this was the countryside. It was right on the edge. It touched the city on one side, or almost, and on the other side was the countryside.
The mansion was bordered to the north by the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré and to the south by a place for strolling much appreciated by Parisians, the Avenue des Tuileries, now called the Champs-Élysées. From this road, walkers could enjoy a magnificent view of the future Évreux mansion.
It was a very fashionable place to stroll in one of the routes to Versailles, so everyone could see the building.
The Count chose Armand Claude Mollet to build the project. The architect was also the owner of the land upon which the house was being built, and his condition for selling it was that he would be appointed to build the mansion himself.
If we look at the work Mollet produced, we can see he wasn't a very great or significant architect. His architecture was very heavy and very stolid. The details aren't very well defined.
The future Évreux mansion would not dazzle with its originality. But the Count was vain and insisted on some exceptional dimensions. At 90 meters wide and 80 meters deep, it would include a cellar, a ground floor, a noble upper floor, and an attic space, and would be built between a courtyard and a garden.
The garden is huge, thanks to successive acquisitions by Évreux, who wanted to have the biggest garden possible. Then in the middle there's this house, which is absolutely colossal, with so many windows and such height. It's like a crossover between a Parisian townhouse and a chateau. In terms of its dimensions and spatial organization, this architecture is quite exceptional. When it came to building it, he was very motivated by influence and appearance. It was as if he was saying, "Look what I can do."
This was a mansion whose huge size, luxury, and opulence would serve to illustrate to all the Count's power and prestige. The problem was that for protection purposes, its splendor had to be hidden behind high walls. So how could he shine without risking being robbed or murdered?
The problem with the Parisian mansion is that if you're far from the street because you're between the courtyard and the garden and not on the street like Italian mansions, you need to catch the eye of the audience to show them this is an important home. So the gates took on that role from the 17th century onwards, when we see the development of some very big gates in Paris.
A colossal gate like a triumphal arch decorated with the Count's coat of arms. On either side were two pairs of Ionic columns, a privilege reserved for blood princes, framing a heavy wooden door. Rebuilt in the 19th century, the current gate has retained the same dimensions.
Great architecture in the classical tradition involved making very tall doors. And by going up very high, we can see all the elevation, a corner of sky. It was all about impressive staging.
This staging was something the Count wanted to push to its limits. The gate opened onto a huge courtyard. Its semicircular shape would facilitate maneuvering the carriages. On either side, two service courtyards would welcome the staff quarters, the kitchens, an orangerie, and some huge stables.
50 horses was a huge number. You need a groom for X number of horses, and you'd have to pay them, you'd have to feed them, etc. That meant some considerable expenditure in terms of energy and money.
The more rooms you had, the more important you were. It's a bit like the number of staff you had in your home. It was a very important social marker.
The Count also wanted to stand out from the crowd in terms of the interior. Until then, townhouses and castles only had one succession of rooms overlooking the courtyard and garden. This arrangement of rooms limited how one moved around inside. So Armand Claude Mollet opted for a very popular style at that time, a double-depth house.
They made two constructions back to back. In the middle of this double house was a big dividing wall that had doors through it. So there were rooms on the courtyard side and rooms on the garden side. And you could move around through these rooms, creating more complexity and subtlety in terms of how the rooms were arranged.
The project was huge, but work got started very quickly and enthusiastically. The pale stone was transported by river from the Paris region in a continuous flow. It took just 2 years for the architect to complete the major works.
Our forefathers had skill in terms of construction that were absolutely remarkable simply because they couldn't afford to get things wrong. Today we can make mistakes. We just bring the machine back, and in 3 days, the pile of earth that was on the right is now on the left. Back then, if you got it wrong, you had to find 300 people to move your earth. Work sites back then were very well organized indeed.
On December 14, 1720, the Count inaugurated his mansion, keen to lay out his riches before Paris society. Even the regent came. For the first time in its history, state power passed through the gates of the future Élysée Palace. On the ground floor, one room particularly attracted attention, the ceremonial salon, now the ambassador's salon in the center of the building.
This was the center of everything. From the courtyard, you could come straight into this room, which was also open onto the garden on the other side. It was the heart of the system.
The walls were covered with wooden panels that had been carved out in the workshop and then assembled like a jigsaw puzzle, providing a huge framework. A gap was left between the wooden panels and the wall to insulate the building from damp and cold.
The decoration was ever more luxurious. Noble woods were used. There was no papier-mâché like they had in the 19th century. Everything was carved from a solid piece and covered with gold leaf. These walls cost a lot of money.
The decoration using bellicose motifs recalled the Count's exploits.
Basically, Évreux wanted to express how he saw himself. He loved war. He loved the arts. He was the complete man.
The regent was so impressed by the magnificence of the house and by this courtier so eager to please the court that he awarded the Count 740 toises of land from the Champs-Élysées, a half-moon shape that finished off the final design of the garden. The operation was a success. The Count was delighted, but his young wife less so. This woman, whose dowry had been the Count of Évreux's ticket to the court, was horrified to discover the apartments on the first floor that were reserved for her.
When he inaugurated his mansion, part of it was finished, but the apartments on the first floor were not. Anne Crozat soon realized things were not going to work out, and she was right.
Turning his back on his wife, the Count lived alone in his dazzling mansion in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. He would live there until his death 30 years later. The story of the Élysée might have ended there, but it was not to be. This building seemed to have an uncanny pull that would continue over centuries. an ability to attract the powerful, and as such, its fate was forever linked to that of France. (1805) Paris. Half a century after the Count's death, France was under the yoke of a new power. That of self-proclaimed French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. A product of the revolution, he knew that power was fragile and that the capital could rise against him at any time. He began weaving his web in order to secure his hold over Paris.
Napoleon had this desire to rebuild an imperial court like they had under the Ancien Régime, with a need to return to those places associated with the aristocracy.
Napoleon wanted to set up his entire court in the mansions lining his palace at Les Tuileries. His sister Caroline and his most faithful comrade-in-arms, Joachim Murat, would have prominent positions.
Murat was a military man. He was a divisional general.
He was known for his sumptuous adornments. Even on the battlefield, he'd be covered with furs and jewels.
Napoleon paired him up with his sister Caroline, who was a very ambitious woman. She would go on to try and increase her power, even sometimes shifting away from her brother.
They were an insatiable couple, but for the time being, had to sing the praises of the empire. To do this, Napoleon tasked them with a mission to throw weekly balls in the capital to ensure the loyalty of the bourgeoisie.
10 years earlier, they were in the midst of a revolution, so the nobility, this imperial society, had to find new reference points. And these reference points would be receptions at the Élysée.
Caroline's keen eye fell on an old abandoned house, the Évreux mansion. Since the Count's death, the building had been the property of the Marquise de Pompadour and then of Bathilde d'Orléans before falling from grace during the Revolution.
On the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, there were stores, a butcher, and animals inside the courtyard of the Élysée. It really was a big mess following the revolution.
The mansion had lost its splendor but was still the largest townhouse in the capital. Caroline saw its potential. She transformed it into the most populous spot in Paris and a springboard for her ambitions. The only problem was that it didn't have a room that was big enough, that measured up to the empire and its powers. The Murat couple decided to knock through the dividing wall and join two salons on the ground floor with the state apartments. But such an operation threatened the building's stability.
70 years later, they would put in a steel beam to support what was above. But at that time, even the use of iron was restricted. So this was a major task.
To stop the western part of the building from collapsing, the architects propped up the ceiling to support the weight of the whole structure. The wall was then knocked down and a beam set between the dividing wall and the outside wall. This dangerous work revealed a significant fact. The Élysée was never built to become a seat of power.
One should not forget that one was taking a townhouse, a very big one at that, and turning it into a very important place of power for receiving guests. But it wasn't enormous, so they didn't know where to put the musicians. In the end, they put them outside, where there was a kind of stage, so that the entire room could be given over to the dancers. You can imagine having women here in their crinolines. You wouldn't be able to fit that many in.
But a major difficulty for architects remained: creating a suitable access to the principal floor where Joachim Murat would take up residence. Until that point, access was via two small staircases located in the east and west pavilions of the central dwelling.
The fact that the house did not have a staircase during the whole of the 18th century is something totally atypical for a Parisian townhouse, and one might imagine that for Murat it was absolutely unthinkable not to have a ceremonial staircase. In reality, there was no obvious solution. The solution that was economical and quite effective from an architectural point of view was to keep it within the existing volumes. But the problem with that is that this ceremonial staircase lacks a little ceremony. It is relatively small and a little squashed.
An imperial staircase, for which 4 salons were sacrificed. Modest in size, this staircase had to strike the visitor in terms of its decoration. A railing cast in lead, with chiseled foliage, in a choice of motifs that today have been lost, but which celebrated the empire and the house's extravagant owner.
The central carpet on the staircase was in imitation tiger skin, bright yellow with black stripes. You have to imagine that this was a black and white universe with a yellow splash down the middle. This is not the restrained approach one might think would be applied here. But to understand, one simply has to look at Murat in his portraits, astride his saddle pad.
On December 1st, 1806, a lavish reception marked the end of the work, which cost more than 2 million francs. A fortune for the time. In the Murat Salon, 4 paintings depicting ancient symbols such as Trajan's column, the Tiber, and the Nile were like propaganda for this princely couple. On a par with the Roman Empire, and on a par with Napoleon.
The Murat were doing the receiving, so naturally this helped extend their own influence. But Murat only existed because of the emperor. Naturally, he believed that he existed in his own glory, which he gladly displayed. But without the emperor, there was no Murat.
It's never a good idea to try to play equal to an emperor. 2 years later, Napoleon crowned Caroline and Joachim Queen and King of Naples. This was a bitter victory for the couple, as they were forced to leave a capital over which they had cast their influence, and leave behind this house with its mysterious power.
The emperor obviously wanted to keep them away from Paris. There was enough plotting already, especially for royalists, so he didn't need any further risk.
In exchange for their promotion, the Murats had to hand the Elysée and everything in it over to Napoleon. The palace became Napoleon's private residence, and then, in a new move for the time, his state residence.
The Élysée was not the Tuileries. It should be remembered that the garden there was open to the public, and people could walk almost right underneath his windows when he was at the Tuileries. He liked to retire to the Élysée to be able to prepare for both political and major military operations.
Napoleon prepared the Russian campaign at the Élysée Palace. And for the first time in a century, the Élysée became a place where decisions of power were taken, and also where the sovereign was located.
Ironically, it was in the silver salon designed by his sister Caroline that on June 22, 1815, Napoleon signed a document confirming his abdication after the terrible defeat at Waterloo. The emperor had fallen, and the Élysée once again became one house among many, even serving as a furniture repository. It wasn't until 3 decades later that another Bonaparte revived this sleeping abode. On February 24, 1848, the Parisians, starved by 2 poor harvests, once again revolted. King Louis-Philippe was forced to abdicate, and the Second Republic was declared. A few days later, after a long exile in London, a man appeared in Paris. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the fallen emperor.
In 1848, the legend surrounding the emperor was such that the name Napoleon Bonaparte continued to have a formidable influence on French opinion, so much so that in the presidential elections, Napoleon came out on top with more than 5 million votes.
Louis Napoleon became the first ever president of the French Republic. On December 12th, the palace was assigned by decree to be the residence of the French president.
Louis Napoleon Bonaparte did not want to go to the Élysée. He wanted to live at the Tuileries like the French rulers before him.
In fact, Louis Napoleon secretly harbored other ambitions. On the evening of June 2, 1851, the Prince President gathered his lieutenants around him. With a very serious look on his face, he launched Operation Rubicon, a coup d'etat through which he hoped to gain full power and restore the empire.
It was in the Silver Salon that he finally dictated the message that would be printed up as his declaration of power.
The Second Empire had been declared, and the man who now called himself Napoleon III took up residence at the Tuileries. As for the Élysée, it would have a place of prominence on the political landscape being constructed by the emperor. It would be home to guests of France and the centerpiece of French diplomacy.
And the Élysée did indeed receive distinguished guests, including the Tsar of Russia, the Shah of Iran, and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And the first of these diplomatic missions involved a reconciliation with none other than the Queen of England. Napoleon III invited Queen Victoria to the Élysée Palace.
The Élysée was being used to make Napoleon III's great European dream come true. But Évreux's old townhouse had never been designed to welcome such guests. It wasn't big enough to accommodate the dozens of servants that travel with heads of state. The staff quarters were falling into ruins. Security was virtually non-existent.
He was determined that if he were to receive the kings and queens of England, then he had to demonstrate that France was not in a similar state of decay as the Élysée was at the time.
In order for the Élysée to fulfill this mission, the emperor could not skimp on the budget. With a considerable sum of 12 million francs, he launched the largest renovation the Élysée had seen since its creation.
This project was colossal, going on for almost 10 years.
Everything below stairs was destroyed right down to the cellars. It was a huge task.
The gate, the perimeter wall, the east and west staff quarters, and the wing of private apartments were raised. Huge efforts were put into transforming the Évreux mansion into a spacious, luxurious, and above all, secure palace. First, it had to be isolated on all sides. To the east, a new street would be built, Rue de la Reine Hortense, renamed Rue de l'Élysée.
This street was created to totally isolate this center of power. It's one of the rare parts of Paris where there are no neighbors. And then there was this English-style urban planning operation with these little porticos that looked kind of Victorian, with English-style courtyards, bringing a touch of London to Paris, something Napoleon III held dear.
The Élysée was now out of sight and closed in on itself. The staff quarters were rebuilt. There were now 3 terraced levels open to the courtyard with bays created in the old arcades. To the west, the stables were replaced to accommodate infantry and cavalry units.
This mansion was totally transformed into a place of power. So there had to be a kind of militarization of the site to guarantee its security.
Basically, he transformed this mansion in such a way that it could provide a retreat in case of an assault on the Tuileries. He could retreat to the Élysée, stand firm and resist, without ever having to leave Paris. I don't know that's what he had in mind, but in terms of the project, that's what it looked like.
Napoleon III may have cleaned up the staff quarters, but he wanted to keep the Évreux mansion intact. This residence that once welcomed his illustrious uncle, and where he had strolled in the gardens as a child.
He was the man who started the great transformation of Paris with Haussmann. So he wasn't conservative in terms of architecture. It wasn't that he didn't want anything new, but he did want to restore this building, from top to bottom perhaps. But he wanted to keep it as it was, and there is a sensibility there that is rather endearing.
But when the restoration work began, the architects made a terrible discovery.
When they dismantled the paneling, they discovered that walls were in a terrible state. The palace was actually collapsing.
Évreux's mansion had been eaten away from the inside and was threatening to collapse because of a surprising weakness: the fireplaces.
In the old days, fireplaces were put in the middle of the wall, so when the partitioning was changed, you had to change the location of the fireplace. And when you changed the location of the fireplace, you cut a section out of the wall to put the conduits through. But once you've done that 2 or 3 times, the wall is full of holes. One more hole and the whole thing collapses.
To save the building, they had to rebuild all the supporting walls. For this, the woodwork had to be dismantled, the walls demolished, and the floors dismantled. The Élysée was completely emptied, like a shell.
In terms of the plasterwork, which would have been destroyed when the floors were replaced, they took moldings of it and then reproduced the plasterwork from these molds and put it back. So what we have today is plaster moldings of the 18th century originals.
Once the major works were completed, Napoleon launched his diplomatic offensive. He had 2 key assets up his sleeve. The first was a salon where he openly displayed France's future alliances, the Salon des Portraits.
This Salon des Portraits contains paintings of all the monarchs of the time of Napoleon III. Everyone who, along with Napoleon III, made up a kind of G7 meeting of the period, including the Pope.
His second asset was a brand new ballroom built after Murat's lounge. Classical in style, it included all the codes of the empire. But above all, it was designed using the best technology of the time,
He had to show that France dominated modern techniques. So you had very large mirrors that are made with mercury. They were the biggest that could be made at the time. They had to not distort the image too much, because if you're in a room where the reflections are moving weirdly when you look around, it's going to make you feel sick pretty quickly. It had to be perfectly flat, and that was very complicated to do.
It was at the Élysée Palace that his uncle had launched his fatal campaign. And it was also at the Élysée Palace that Napoleon III would form alliances with the enemies of yesterday. In August 1855, Queen Victoria visited 55 Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré.
You might say that on that day, the rivalry that dated from the consulate and the empire was erased. All the other reasons for their rivalry remained, but there was no longer this bone of contention between Paris and London.
Napoleon won his bet. He had sealed a historic alliance with England that would change the course of history. From then on, the Élysée became the beating heart of France's foreign policy. Its prestigious guests included kings, princes, emperors, and sultans.
When the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire visited Paris, he came with his animals. He put a tent in the courtyard of the Élysée. It was the same when Nicolas Sarkozy received Gaddafi.
In fewer than 15 years, Napoleon III transformed the Élysée into the flagship of French diplomacy and one of the state's most prestigious buildings. But history would once again turn the tables. In 1870, a century and a half after the construction of the Élysée Palace, his defeat to Prussia ended Napoleon III's empire. The Third Republic was declared. A new reign began at the Élysée, that of the presidents of the Third Republic.
The power left the Élysée because the presidents of the Third Republic only had a ceremonial role. The real power was at Matignon, or rather in the ministries.
And since they didn't have much power, they had to maintain what little they had. And to do that, they entertained as much as they could and as best they could.
The Élysée had lost the aura of power. But one president, Sadi Carnot, a brilliant mind, gave the Élysée its centerpiece by making a virtue out of necessity in 1889.
France, under the Third Republic, was still surrounded by empires and monarchies. So any entertaining the state did had to be absolutely splendid.
The palace reached a saturation point very quickly.
Initially, they used the salons and the great salon on the first floor, hosting lots of balls. But there were so many that it completely shook up the structure of the floor. There was a lot of traffic.
The Élysée was not suitable for representing France and this ambitious new republic that wanted to impose itself on the international scene. And with the centenary of the Revolution and the World's Fair both coming up in 1889, it had to be up to the challenge. President Sadi Carnot launched a major construction project for the palace. He wanted to create a sumptuous reception room worthy of the greatest European monarchies.
All our leaders have always had this hang-up about Versailles and the Louvre, unwilling to give up on the effect of great classical stone architecture. But at the same time, they needed a framework from which to be able to construct quickly, and the benefits of iron were very tempting.
The Eiffel Tower had just been completed in this innovative material and was the standard bearer. The new ballroom was going to be 36 meters long, 24 meters wide, and 14 meters high, with a metal frame. The walls would be made from brick. This approach would ensure the building could be up in under 6 months. But most of all, it would result in a volume hitherto unseen.
A ballroom of this size could only exist with a metal structure, because the columns are very thin, very high, and very light, and they could be decorated. This frees up the floor and the roof from everything they had to use before, namely pillars. So it was wonderful.
The ceilings were covered in the colors of the Republic: blue, white, and red. For the first time at the Élysée Palace, the Republic imposed its architecture through state-of-the-art technology.
The ballroom was symbolic of France's industrial influence and what it was capable of. But you couldn't see that from the outside. You had to go inside the ballroom and look up at the ceiling to see the abundance and richness of this fledgling industrial France of the 19th century.
In the ceilings, there were also outlets for hot air and smoke, because it was all lit with gas. There were many wonderful chandeliers, and all of that had to be evacuated. So there are ventilation grills hidden within the ornate decoration, which is in fact hiding a whole system.
Sadi Carnot had no intention of stopping there. To welcome his guests, he commissioned an imposing glass and steel structure in the courtyard to house the cloakrooms required for hosting such events.
Here, there was a conservatory-like structure with a metal frame and glass that occupied virtually the entire width and the entire height of the first floor.
This unfortunate construction made the main facade overlooking the courtyard very ugly indeed, especially as it was constructed in glass, so you could see the servants and visitors from the palace inside. It ended up with it being rather rudely nicknamed the monkey cage.
For the Élysée, the new century opened with a period of stagnation. The palace took on the appearance of a bourgeois house where boredom had settled in for a long stretch. In 1940, after the fall of France, President Albert Lebrun left behind an empty palace that the German occupying forces did not wish to use. And as if to draw a line under the end of the Third Republic, the monkey cage was demolished in 1947. It would take almost a decade for power to finally return to the Élysée. In the cold winter of 1959, a car escorted by gendarmes headed for 55 Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré. It was carrying Charles de Gaulle, hero of the Second World War, who was about to become the first president of the brand new Fifth Republic. A regime under which he would be the head of the armed forces and of the executive branch, the most powerful man in the country.
January 8, 1959, was when political power definitively returned to the Élysée.
De Gaulle himself said, "Did anyone think I would take the helm just to be a ribbon cutter?" This time, we had a kind of Republican monarch, and that was de Gaulle.
A Republican monarch who, as dictated by tradition, must take up residence in the former Évreux mansion.
He hated the Élysée, this former mansion that was now squashed within the city. He couldn't breathe there. It was not a place from which to exercise power. De Gaulle wanted symbols and an expansive view.
De Gaulle suggested moving the presidency to the Château de Vincennes or Les Invalides, places that, in his opinion, better embodied this new presidential power.
When he suggested Vincennes, they said, "But General, Vincennes is too expensive. The École Militaire would be too difficult. Don't even think about Les Invalides." The Élysée was the only choice.
The general had to make the best of a bad job, and as such, the Evora mansion had to bend to his will. Like a true military leader, he embarked upon an in-depth reorganization of the palace. Until then, it had been a ceremonial residence. But now, the Élysée Palace was to become the nation's command center.
De Gaulle arrived. He needed teams, civil, military, and foreign affairs.
There wasn't enough room. General de Gaulle's staff was 6 or 7 times bigger than that of his predecessor, René Coty. One of the first things de Gaulle did in '59, when he arrived, was to reclaim the entire first floor. Because until then, the first floor had been used solely to receive visiting foreign heads of state. When he was asked where they should be put, de Gaulle replied, "I don't want to be seeing kings in pajamas in my corridors."
On the first floor, under the eaves around the east and west courtyards, every last corner was transformed into a workspace. The palace turned into a gigantic anthill where 400 to 800 people were bustling around every day. Two townhouses at numbers 14 and 18 Rue de l'Élysée were purchased and converted into annexes. The general then set his sights on a strategic part of the palace, a salon located in the center of the building, namely the Salon Doré, or Gilded Salon.
This was the first time that a president of the Republic took up residence on the first floor in a very centralized way. It was a pretty obvious symbol. Everything started from there and converged to that point. They still refer to the general's office at the Élysée today.
Since Charles de Gaulle, every subsequent president of the Fifth Republic has taken up residence at the Élysée. Despite its shortcomings, this 18th century palace has established itself as the first residence in France, the hyperstructure of French power. Could France or the rest of the world now ever imagine the president living anywhere other than the Élysée, this gilded symbol of Republican pomp?